Today's panel is called Narrating Conscience, Modes of Witnessing. And we have Dr. Sheri Fink and Colin Dayan, and our Stanford respondent, David Palumbo-Liu, with us. Each panelist will speak for, what are your plans?
30 minutes?
30 minutes, okay, and then we'll have a response and a Q&A. Sheri Fink is an author and journalist who has reported globally on health, medicine, and science. She's currently covering the storm fallout in New York City and surrounding areas. She's the 2010 Pulitzer Prize and National Magazine Award winner in investigative journalism for The Deadly Choices at Memorial, about difficult choices made at a New Orleans hospital during the aftermath of Katrina. Fink is a contributor to ProPublica and a senior fellow with the New America Foundation and the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. She's also author of War Hospital, A True Story of Surgery and Survival on the Balkan Crisis, winner of the American Medical Writers Association Special Book Award, and finalist for Penn Martha Albrand Award. Colin Dayan is the Robert Penn Warren Professor in the Humanities at Vanderbilt. She's an expert in literary, legal, and religious studies of the Americas. Her books include Haiti, History and the Gods, The Story that was published in 1998, The Story of Cruel and Unusual, 2007, and most recently, The Law is a White Dog, How Legal Rituals Make and Unmake Persons, selected as a Choice Top 25 Outstanding Academic Book of 2011. Our Stanford respondent, David Palumbo-Liu, is the Louise Hewlett-Nixon Professor of Comparative Literature and Professor by courtesy of English here at Stanford. Please welcome Colin Dayan and Sheri Fink. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, I just would like to start by thanking everybody involved with this conference for allowing me to join you by Skype. It wasn't planned, obviously, and it's less than ideal, but I do appreciate it. I'm working on a few stories here that feel important, and when we come to talking about conscience, it was feeling my conscience was torn by fulfilling this commitment and my great desire to be with you today, and also this real desire to report on some issues that I think are affecting a lot of vulnerable people here who are still feeling the impact of the hurricane now, almost 2 weeks later. So thank you. And also, please forgive me for, since I haven't been with you the last day, just not knowing exactly where we are in the discussion of conscience. So I hope that my remarks will be somewhat apropos. Also like to apologize to the respondent because of everything, I wasn't able to get my prospectus of the talk to him. So he will be doing an improv response to what I have to say today. So thank you and apologies for that. And I am going to speak more or less extemporaneously. When it comes to conscience in reporting, there are sort of three aspects that I'd like to discuss today. One would be the conscience as it applies or guides topic selection in reporting. So, how we as reporters or editors choose what topics we report on and have historically. The second aspect is the conscience of the individual reporter. And the third aspect is reportage that depicts or presents quandaries of conscience. And so I'd like to talk just a little bit about all three of these. So beginning with the first one, I feel like a lot of times in American journalism currently, and this varies really by country, we have this goal of objective reporting, and there are many debates about whether that is possible or not. But one thing that really can't be argued with is that there is, once we work on a story, we can aim very much for objectivity and showing all sides of the issue. But just the mere fact of selecting a topic to report on, that in and of itself is a decision that can be certainly affected by conscience and opinion, and may not be, there may not be a possible way to be objective about that. And so there is this tension between perhaps choosing worthy topics, topics that call to the conscience, versus this goal of being objective and trying to cover everything fairly. Wrapped within this is the idea that there are the ethics of the profession itself, objectivity, doing things in a journalistically ethical way, that sometimes come into conflict with the fundamental responsibilities of being a human being, let's say. So you have this dual loyalty. And I guess to give some examples, say that you're reporting, and this has been a case for me. I did a series a few years ago for a public radio show that looked at the issue of slums and urban poverty. So I traveled to several slums around the world, large famous ones, and looked at various aspects of ways that people coped with that situation, and what the conditions were as the number of people living in urban populations was set to reach a new height and landmark. That was the occasion for the series. And so, the principle in journalism obviously is that you don't pay your sources. But imagine that you are out in the middle of a slum and you've asked a woman who is scraping by every day trying to just do a little job so that she can get a few pennies to go buy some food for her child. And you're following her around all day, and she's graciously allowed you to do that. And at the end of the day, she hasn't succeeded in getting the 10 cents that she usually would. And this is an actual case, followed her around. She's knocking on doors, trying to do odd jobs for people in wealthier parts of the area around the slum in Kenya where she was from. And at the end of the day, she didn't succeed. She had very little food. She wanted to buy some greens to cook for dinner for her child. And so what is a reporter to do? Not pay their source, or do the human thing and provide some money so that she and her child could eat. So that's sort of an example there. And in case you're curious, I gave her the money, obviously, but I think there are cases where that tension is more complicated. That's just one example. And so that brings us into this topic of the conscience of the reporter and kind of handling human interactions with sources. And I think that one of the things that, as I've kind of stayed in the people who we report on, and obviously that's very obvious. And when you're going out to do a story as the objective reporter, really that shouldn't probably technically be foremost in your mind. How is the story going to affect the people who I'm writing about? But it's inevitable that it does, and it will, particularly if you report on traumatic subjects like wars and disasters. People are already raw and vulnerable, and sometimes the reporting that we do, even merely asking them questions, can have effects on their well-being. And I do think that that's something worth taking seriously. And again, it's sort of an issue of conscience. It may not be something that you technically have to do, but it is a concern of the conscience. So this idea, this tension again of wanting to write a story that may contribute in some way to a greater good, If we want to frame it in sort of utilitarian terms, versus the immediate risk of hurting the people who are involved in that story. And then there are always unintended consequences too. And so should the reporter have some guilt, a sense of guilt or conscience when unintended things occur after a story? I remember I've had several occasions where the book that was mentioned that I wrote, War Hospital, about this war hospital in Bosnia, Srebrenica, where there was a genocide in the mid-90s. And I wrote about what was seemingly very heroic work by the doctors and nurses and Doctors Without Borders aid workers who worked just under siege for extended periods. And in the course of reporting the book and telling the story of this war and genocide through the eyes of the medical professionals, one of the Doctors Without Borders nurses who I interviewed had a very bad reaction after our interactions, and it triggered some post-traumatic trauma, or at least that the timing was quite soon after our interview, and she ended up having to be admitted to a hospital for for psychological complications, and was in a mental institution for a short period of time. So just that, sort of unintended, certainly the last thing I wanted to do was to hurt this person in any way who had heroically helped people in the midst of a genocide. But there are these unintended consequences of our work. And so this sort of guilt or conscience of the individual reporter comes into play there. And that's one of really several examples that I can point to. And I really sometimes find that it's very hard to predict who it is who the reporting is going to hurt. You think that maybe the person who you think comes off looking bad in a story is the one who's going to be upset by it, but often just really unexpected things can cause that. So sometimes I think the reporters may have to struggle with questions of do I do this at all, and am I hurting people? So again, more questions of conscience. And then one more thing under this topic number 2, this conscience of the reporter, that I'd like to mention is the limits on citizenship, in a way, that reporters either put on themselves or sometimes news organizations' ethics guidelines call for. Again, the reporter is expected in our culture to be an objective reporter of the facts, and wants to maintain that trust with the public, therefore shouldn't be involved in certain causes or advocacy, particularly if it's related to the subjects that he or she is reporting on. And in some ways, the reporter's opinion, speech, or activity is squelched in order to maintain that trust with the public. And I think that can often feel like a very complicated issue of the conscience, because as a human being, as a citizen, you may want to take action on certain issues. You may want to express your points of view, but unless you're a columnist, that's really not appropriate as a reporter. So am I doing more good by focusing on these topics in an objective manner and getting the truth out to many thousands and thousands of people, or am I compromising something because I can't be an activist in the traditional sense of activism, because that would compromise my objectivity as a reporter. And then going to the last topic area, the reportage depicting or presenting quandaries of the conscience. And I think this is where reporting can be a really effective way of involving the public in or helping the public to explore issues of the conscience. And one example we could look at would be this Katrina story that I wrote about, and of course just one of many stories that you could find on any particular day that is in some ways aimed at opening up a discussion, allowing the public to grapple with very difficult issues. And this particular story, for those who aren't familiar with it, was about Memorial Medical Center, which was a hospital, community hospital, around since the 1920s in New Orleans. That was one of about more than a half dozen hospitals that found themselves, the people in the hospital, surrounded by water, power out. The heat rose very quickly in those buildings. It was August heat when Hurricane Katrina hit, and there was no electricity. Just imagine trying to take care of patients in those conditions in the dark with flashlights, unable to provide them even really basic medical care. Conditions grew very bad very quickly, and also the rescue took a very long time, which came by helicopter and by boats. It just took days to get people out, similarly as it did with some of the hospitals after Sandy, Hurricane Sandy here just a week and a half ago. These hospitals weren't surrounded by water after the initial wave came in. They had lost their power, but it still took several days for the ambulances to come and take each complicated patient out and find a place for them to go. It took, surprisingly, to me, just about the same amount of time. In the midst of this, and what the story looks at, is that there were two really very fundamental ethical choices that became primary in people's minds, in the doctors' and nurses' minds. One was, in what order do we evacuate these patients? Do we take the sickest first, or do we take the healthiest first? And grappling with those questions of, do we make this a decision based on principles of justice, or do we make it a decision on principles of utilitarianism and who might have the greatest number of years left, greatest chance of surviving their current illness? So that was one decision point. And the second decision point, after a number of the elderly, more sick patients were left to go last, and their condition worsened and worsened, some of the healthcare professionals, according to the rules of their conscience, decided to give them medications to help speed their deaths. They told me that they felt that this was the right choice for people who they didn't think would have a good chance of surviving. On the other hand, some of those patients, including one in particular, just happened to be a very heavy-set patient who was on a very high floor, was going to be hard to carry down, but was conscious, fed himself breakfast, wanted very much to leave the facility, had certainly serious medical problems, but not necessarily ones that would have been fatal. And he was among the roughly 24 patients who was injected with this cocktail of drugs and found dead later when the people came to pick up the bodies from that hospital. So the story really was about, telling in detail what had happened from the different perspectives. And what ensued, I think, from the comments on the websites, the story ran in the New York Times Magazine and the website of ProPublica, a nonprofit news organization, was really kind of a very, to me, I was very happy to see a very nuanced debate about the ethics and the conscience issues that were involved here. So I think that's one example of where reportage can open these issues that we might consider in an academic conference out in some way to a general public, translating these issues into plain language that anybody can think about. So I think it is a channel through which citizens can explore and weigh moral issues. However, on the other side, I would just throw out there that also reportage, the anecdote in particular, there's a question, does it have too much power? And I think individual stories can be so powerful that they can be persuasive and can sway the reader in certain directions. And so there's a power to that storytelling that can be abused or even inadvertently, even unintentionally. So, and related to that, or closely related to that, is the power of reportage to manipulate opinion and conscience. So I think I think that's about a half hour, and I'd like to just leave it there to sum up that I feel that the issue of the reporter and conscience is a very rich one, and I've just touched on a few topic areas, conscience guiding selection, topic selection in reporting, the conscience of the individual reporter going out to report, and then reportage as an avenue through which the larger community can explore issues of conscience. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheri. I'm sorry you're not here, but I'm going to go up to the podium and try to address you and everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and finally to meet so many people that I've wanted to meet. This talk is called Like a Dog, Animal Law, Human Cruelty, and the Ethics of Care, and it represents I think, a shift in our conversation. So I just wanted to lay out a few things that I wanted to do as tentatively as it will be. First, in order to tell the story of inhumanity, I depend on what is absolutely not human, or what is not ordinarily thought of as human. The next thing is I want to disavow and question what we mean by human or humane treatment. I'd like to think through with you not just the nature of personhood as applied to humans, but the problem of animality. So finally, I want to ask that you imagine with me what conscience would look like if it were to become a perspectival phenomenon, a means of seeing otherwise or crosswise. In other words, a translation between ontologically disparate points of view. And Locke has been with me for a very long time now, perhaps in ways rather different than he was invoked yesterday. But one of the things about the essay on human understanding that always obsessed me were those moments that became very, very, one would have to say, fantastical, his parables, where he pushed on the idea that there are differences between animal and human consciousness. He suggested that perhaps those differences were just a matter of degree, as when he writes about the rational parrot that competes with the dull, irrational man. But I'm very, very interested in the materiality of Locke's essay in those moments. And so I'm just going to begin then with laying an atmosphere, and I hope that this is a space for critique and upset, as well as civil consensus. The streets of New York are sometimes dangerous if you happen to be black, poor, or a pit bull. The Deep South is sometimes dangerous if you happen to be white, poor, or a pit bull. This catalog puts in relation humans and dogs in what might seem a tasteless or even racist merging. But the proximity matters. Whenever I turn from academic or literary context to the lived daily reality of what is happening to the majority of people in this country, I realize that animality is what we need to consider, not claims for the human. I think now of the speaking and remembering cows of Anne's film. They are witnesses. They appear in proximity with the human animals in their midst. They are an appeal, as is her whole film, to our attention, to our attentive, not speculative faculties. So in writing for years about the legal history and practice of slavery and imprisonment in the Americas, I learned that the idea of the beast, or to quote the natural historian of Jamaica, Edward Long, the brute icon of the human, was a category best avoided. After all, in natural histories of the Caribbean and the American South, categorical thinking ushered in boundaries that not only separated humans from animals, but also generated new ideas about what was to count as human. These new taxonomies depended on the rank of animal to embody the slave, a fiction of law that became a moral truth, a fantastic amalgam of human, animal, and inanimate thing. Such racist fantasies could locate, for example, a Guinea Negro in the same category as learned horses, learned and even talking dogs. So it is natural to sense the danger of the juxtapositions that I'm making. But my recent work is an attempt to trace a form of ethics that moves beyond dehumanization and beyond the anthropocentric worldview that supports it. Instead, I want to focus on categories, the oscillation between categories usually kept separate, especially in mainstream thought, between human and non-human animals. So I have been, just for the last few years, focusing on breed bans, euthanasia, and preemptive justice, and my analysis of extinctions in particular lay bare the various mechanisms by which certain kinds of humans and dogs, once labeled as expendable, can be sacrificed to the realities of a control that can easily and lawfully be extended to others. So as our world becomes more brutal, or to move closer to home, as our prisons become receptacles, not only for that race of men, as Jefferson put it, but for ever increasing numbers of persons considered unfit or disposable, we need to consider how life is curbed in various other, less obvious zones of exclusion. So I take dogs as my prompt, and I hope to reshuffle our conceptual schemes. I'm not interested in animal rights and giving animals what we think it is we get as bearers of rights and obligations in standard liberal moral terms, nor do I propose a turn, whether sentimental or caring, to Levinas's dog Bobby or Derrida's cat. Instead, I want to attempt to draw us into the lives and destiny of dogs, and through the root of the dog, then, I want to examine what something I call a legal ethnography might look like. In these times of terror, when torture continues unheeded, with kill lists, drone strikes in Afghanistan and elsewhere, with the capacious warehousing of myriad citizens in supermax confinement, or the abandonment of persons in places like Haiti, where hundreds of thousands languish in internally displaced persons camps, nearly 3 years after the earthquake of 2010, to speak about dogs might seem evidence of a dulled or somewhat evasive conscience. When we hear the word dogs, we think cute, we sense nice, we feel sentimental. But I want, nonetheless, to seek the meaning of conscience in the lives of dogs. And I sense that some might be either settling very comfortably or uncomfortably into their seats, because the minute I say dogs, one thinks trivial. She likes dogs. But after all, my concern is not about the larger questions of biodiversity or extinction of exotic species in places where they're especially threatened or endangered. Instead, I'm treating very local extinctions that are close to home, the victims not of colonialism writ large or of broad environmental misuse, but the labeling and abuse of the most commonplace animal in our midst, dogs, particularly the pit bull, and the logic of sacrifice that accompanies this breed. The dog now straddles the divide between feral and domestic, threat and pet. And given its cameo role in contemporary spectacles of demonism and predation, what Cora Diamond calls sheer animal vulnerability, its fate leads to the question I mean to address. What does conscience look like here at the boundaries of humanity, or to go further at the edge of a cherished humanism? So I want to attempt to locate, in both very particular and perhaps theoretical registers, the nexus of animality, human marginalization, and juridical authority. What I ask in extending, for example, the legal standard of unnecessary suffering in animal law, would necessary suffering look like? This is not a philosophical inquiry. I don't attempt to define how and where we draw the line between humans and animals. Rather, I'm trying to contribute to the understanding of how, where, and why human beings, often quite arbitrarily, devise, formulate, and apply lines separating the human and animal, or deliberately blur those lines. Further, in reinterpreting the meaning of human in terms like humane treatment or humanitarian, in bringing them back to their specific local context, I set out to make humanity a position marked by relativity, uncertainty. The nearness, the necessity of relation between animals and humans has become more clear to me whenever civility, its costly and permanent rituals, must be guaranteed. Why, to take up Mary Midgley's point, does a sense of unreality block our attempts to understand our moral relations with animals? Why is the question of the animal so hard to fit into our ethical system? I'm reminded of Arendt's attempt to save political action and political understandings of action from humanitarianism. Like Carl Schmitt, in the terrifically uncomfortable, rather disconcerting text, but I think incisive, The Concept of the Political, written as he turned to Nazism in 1933, like Schmitt, Arendt feared and understood the cunning of any properly political project of humanity. Both struggled with human rights talk, the language of humanity that, in Schmitt's word, has certain incalculable effects, such as denying the enemy the quality of being human and declaring him to be an outlaw of humanity. The acts then can be driven to the most extreme inhumanity. So the question I want to float here is a question that might seem very general, but is actually, I think, quite specific. What is the terrain for human cruelty, and who gets to command its shifts in species and race? It's impossible here to produce the necessary elaborations on a brutality that comes before and after all the enlightenments that have sanctioned authority and violence, but that demand our response and responsibility. So I'm directing my thoughts again to the project that depends on something that is awkwardly political. I'm leaning toward an interpretation of nature and history and politics that sticks us uncomfortably and hardily in the world of particulars, the everyday practices of casual cruelty and commonplace harm, and the claims of conscience that accompany them. So, in my confrontation with and writing about the off-and-on hunger strikes at Pelican Bay and elsewhere, with the excesses of stop and frisk on the streets of New York, and the random but lethal effects of canine profiling, in considering all these things in proximity, I want to think again about the unreal rationality of a racism that depends for its force on the conceptual idea of the superfluous. What can we render as remnants or waste or dirt? What one prisoner in Pelican Bay calls the castaway. We are living in a time of extinctions. Regulatory policies and the police power that accompanies them always resurface. If a dog is a stray, the state has the right to unleash familiar practices of discrimination and violence. The summary disposal of dogs branded as dangerous, vicious, offensive, or a threat to the public can be traced to early common law and later to the range of police measures instituted ostensibly to protect community interests. As I describe in my recent book, The Law is a White Dog, by the 1890s, a series of tort cases began to describe, evaluate, and judge the limits of canine injury and death. When can a dog offensive to humankind be legally killed? That question, I think, applies fully and fulsomely to a number of current events that affect large groups of humans. So let me just cut to the chase here. I want to ask, what are the implications of a certain kind of savage logic that is at the heart of an illegality that is always moderated, legitimized, and reproduced by the humanitarian concern that is in fact analogous to it? Uprootedness and reappropriation put in question the boundaries of humanity, or more importantly, the making and management of human boundary objects. The management of rubbish always draws distinctions between the free and the bound. And I'm very interested in this in my work in Haiti, where we know, of course, that those organizations that are coming to Haiti to help, by and large, do very little on the ground and actually abandon large groups of Haitians to the means of their abandonment. So in emphasizing this kind of subjection, I want to yoke our consciousness to what Reinhold Niebuhr called, and not too happily, the easy conscience of modern man. Reasonable and civil consensus. These words engage me since I'm haunted by the prospect of divisions that allow the continued dispossession of creatures, human and non-human, outside the circle of grace. And I'm thinking that this talk is definitively not only about dogs and the humans who kill them, it is also about why dogs matter now, or might matter now, to our sense of what it means to be social and political animals. I take dogs to stand in for a bridge, the bridge that joins persons to things, both in our law and legal concepts and in the real world of our daily lives. The bridge is what matters because it offers the connectivity between gradations of personhood, or more specifically, a projection of the acceptable or unacceptable citizen. And the dog, like its owner, acceptable when domesticated but cast out when wild, is sacrificed to a social picture that depends for its meaning on the division between polite, rational, civilized, and a violent, savage, and barbaric world. Yet sometimes, and as I was listening to people yesterday, I kept thinking, yet sometimes the division does not hold, since the violence of reason, though masked, is equal in its effects to that of an irrationality cloaked in the semblance of care. Dog and human alike are killed when seen or presented as threats, but we know, especially now in this 21st century, that the engines of control, once systematized and embedded in human affairs, can be applied anywhere and to anyone. I am considering then, and the cases I consider, concern the legitimate ostracism of the useless, whether dog or human. The dog is part and parcel of a long-standing pattern of disavowal, a reiteration of disregard that puts animals writ large safely to the side of moral action and, importantly, moral consideration, the one disavowal operating as a cover for the other. So let me just say that fear is a vice that takes root. Fear and the brutality that accompanies it can only be recognized when the human and animal are brought together, when what yokes us together as creatures puts us in the proverbial same boat. For the language of threat, removal, and loss has become both medium and prompt for the ongoing intimidation and debasement of humans. If we were challenged to write a legal history of deprivation, for example, we could go to no better place than the representation of humans when bounded and sharpened by the dog kind. Now, I want to go to an especially thorny, in the interest of time, question about two particular cases, and then I'll conclude. On April 26th this year, Maryland's highest court decided in a case, Tracy versus Zaleski, that any dog containing pit bull genes is inherently dangerous as a matter of law. The breed alone is evidence, they wrote, that an individual animal is violent. This subjected owners to what the courts call strict liability. The Court of Appeals declared, when an attack involves pit bulls, it is no longer necessary to prove that the particular pit bull or pit bulls are dangerous. So how can you tell when a dog is a pit bull mix? The shape of its head, its stance, its way of looking at you? In his dissent, Judge Clayton Green recognized the absurdity of the majority's opinion's unworkable rule. How much pit bull must there be in a dog to bring it within the strict liability edict? How will that be determined? what rationale exists for any particular percentage of the genetic code to trigger strict liability? A one-drop rule? Pit bulls are not inherently dangerous. They are dogs, and like other dogs, they can become dangerous in certain situations, not because they're part of a particular canine category. So again, how do social realism and the claims of decency permit the continued prosecution of the superfluous? That is the question. The language of threat and removal used to warn against vicious dogs, as I said, applies quite easily to humans deemed offensive or harmful. It is enough to be marginal, undesirable, or aesthetically unpalatable. The other case that I deal with, and I'll just be brief, is a case that many of you probably know, U.S. versus Stevens. It was ostensibly about crush videos. My editor wrote me when the Supreme Court made its decision in 2010 and said, oh, God, you've got to write about this. And I said, well, I think I'm going to hold off a bit because the White Dog book had not yet come out. And I was thinking, well, all I need is to be somehow tarred with the brush of dealing with Robert Stevens in his defense. And here I am today, closing with Robert Stevens, who is, for all who don't know, and he's a gun owner, he's a rural Southerner, and he likes God. The Supreme Court decision struck down a federal law that made it a crime to create or sell dogfight videos and other depictions of animal cruelty. Robert Stevens was an author and small-time film producer. He did not himself believe in dogfights or do dogfights, but he compiled and so showed videotapes. His home was ransacked and raided in 2003 at about 1 a.m. in the morning by a SWAT team, and he was 63. He was only really known by his books, one called Dogs of Velvet and Steel, and a few of his films. He was indicted. A jury in the district court convicted him on 3 different counts of violating U.S. Code Section 48 based on the sale of the 3 videos. And he got a sentence of 37 months, just over 3 years, which was more than twice as long as the sentence served by Michael Vick, who actually staged dogfights. The problem here is how we read the case. And just to close, one of the things about the case is that most people, and many of us here in the room, including myself, would think about the offensive nature of the videos themselves and the potential effects of such videos on the lives of animals. But I always thought there was a deeper subtext to this case that troubled me, and it's what I'm writing about now. And that's the problem of uneven prosecution. Not just on threats to free speech that the government, along with such organizations as the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and the Humane Society, among others, promoted, but also how other questions are raised for those who value animals and do not want to see them intentionally abused and killed. And so I'm going to just end there because I want us to have time for discussion, and I want not to be up here standing with you behind me, which is not where I want to be. So I'm going to close here if we want to talk more about the Stevens case. Basically, the case was, he was not convicted, and many good-hearted people felt, oh my God, all these cats are going to be crushed with high heels now. I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank Nancy for inviting me, and when she wrote me that email, I said I was honored, but I wasn't sure I was the right person for this. And she accused me of false modesty, but it's really not false. I'll try to make the choice not such a bad one. I thought I might frame my remarks by talking about my recent work and my interests, and that might account for me being here. And as Sheri said, I will be improvising to some degree, so I hope that you'll bear with me. So this conference advertises itself as an interdisciplinary conference, and I've been at Stanford 22 years. I've only organized one conference, and it was on rational choice theory and the humanities. And I'll explain why rational choice theory was interesting to me in a moment. But the main idea behind it was, could we get economists, humanists, political scientists, anthropologists to talk to each other, share insights into the diverse ways that we can map human behavior? It was a kind of intellectual plea for bipartisanship. But like Congress today, it had mixed results. And it didn't help that the ranking political scientist who spoke took me aside after the first morning panel and said, "David, this conference is a total failure." So that was a real confidence booster. But he warmed up afterwards. And yet at the end of the second day, he said, it all boils down to this: I believe in facts. So my understanding of rational choice theory is that it takes actors, their preferences, information, and it combines them all to try to figure out how actors can best choose toward their utilities. So that's fine with individuals, I understand that, but how about when we take that kind of logic and put it into policy making? And I'll just cite the most infamous example, which actually, if you Google it, shows up in courses on rational choice thinking. I don't think the example is meant to serve as that, but it has. And it was Larry Summers' famous World Bank memo of 1991 regarding pollution in the third world. For him, the problem with pollution was, and he says this, there's too much in the first world and not enough in the third world. The memo reads, quote, "Dirty industries, just between you and me," and I love that kind of nudge, nudge. "Shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of dirty industries into LDCs, less developed countries? The concern over an agent that causes a 1 in a million change in the odds of prostate cancer is obviously going to be much higher in a country where people survive to get prostate cancer than in a country where under 5 mortality is 200 per thousand. The notion is that it matters less to them in the third world than it would to us because these pollutants shave off less of their life expectancy. The Brazilian Minister of the Interior, Jose Lutzenberger, responded when the memo was leaked, quote, "Your reasoning is perfectly logical, but totally insane. Your thoughts provide a concrete example of the unbelievable alienation, reductionist thinking, social ruthlessness, and the arrogant ignorance of many conventional economists concerning the nature of the world we live in." The upshot of this is that Lutzenberger was fired, and we all know what happened to Larry Summers. So, how do we assess the choices we make? The idea behind rational choice theory was to isolate, in as parsimonious a way as it could, how actors did the best they could with the information at hand. Now, however simple and perhaps convincing this might appear, one of the most problematic elements in this formula for me is not the actor or their utilities, but this issue of information. And here's where I turn to the idea of conscience, and in particular to the case that Sheri Fink reported on. I'll try to blend in some of the remarks she made earlier with the fantastic article that she wrote on Katrina. And I was struck by some of the parallels that one might draw, and maybe you can correct me on this, between the kinds of decisions that the medical practitioners had to make and that journalists have to make as they're faced with this idea of information. The supposed neutrality of information, I would suggest, is shot through and through with choice-making preceding the final choice. Which information would hold priority, which information would be packaged in a particular way to achieve a particular effect. The same notions of what to write, how to write might also apply to medical practitioners, how to treat, when to treat, to what degree to treat. And one of the things that fascinated me about the Katrina article, of course, was this cocktail of morphine and other drugs was delivered supposedly to relieve pain, but there's this very fine line between relieving pain and cutting off the breathing mechanism. So was pain the object or was euthanasia? And that was one of the issues of the court case when the physician insisted it was not euthanasia. So again, language. what kind of words and what kind of information gets packaged in which way. Now, once that efficiency is put into place, this idea, the idea that Sheri mentions about the initial notion of triage, the separation of populations into three different groups. Well, once that first step is made, everything seems to bleed out from that. You can't stop that rupturing because you've made that initial point of decision. And one of the most undecidable elements was apparently intent. You know, what was the basic motivation behind these actions? Was it even a moral choice or a strictly professional one? Again, these borders bleed out into one each other. The sifting through relevant information that was to be useful in the choice, of course, did not stop at the physician's actions, but proliferated contagiously, I would say, from the sphere of medical ethics or journalistic ethics into the legal arena and into the affective realm of the community. And this is something that Sheri just mentioned about reporting. But one of the things that struck me about the reporting on Katrina and this specific case was the overwhelming support the physicians got. Because one of my suppositions, people wanted to get closure. It was just too uncomfortable to dwell in this area of undecidability for so long. And the logic of the facts seemed to justify it in retrospect. And this, I think, appears also in Anne's film, My Neighbor, My Killer, where we have, again, this idea of what and how we bracket out certain kinds of information and to what purpose. The sifting out between multiple motives for reconciliation, living and living together. There's a wonderful retooling of the word conviviality in Paul Gilroy's latest work. What does it mean to live together? And I would maybe suggest that we could look at the idea of conviviality with conscience. And one of the things that Kenneth Arrow, who was instrumental in the idea of rational choice theory, said to me at the conference was that, well, rational choice theory in bracketing out information selectively, and what he meant in particular was history, and two far distant considerations of the future, was that it would indeed prevent genocide. Right? It would be just a clear choice of the information at hand on the ground without regard to prior histories of animosity, of killing, and things like that. Okay, well, besides this interest in the idea of choice making and assessment, my recent book has focused on what I call delivery systems, discursive systems that posit some sort of common trait that deliver other people to us, a common ground in rationality or the body or affect, for example. And as a literary scholar, I consider how the value of literature since the modern age has been supposedly to deliver the lives of others unlike us, to enhance our sphere of empathy. But my work has been more interested not in the idea and value of empathy, which seems to be pretty well set, but at that toggle point that we're faced with when we encounter too much difference or too much difficulty, when we discount the possibility that these kinds of people are enough like us to deserve our empathy. And I argue that certain literary texts situate us precisely in this uncomfortable terrain and force us to account for our choices. In Colin's work, it is that rough cut between dogs and humans that seemingly set up a workable division, and yet here too the categories collapse as soon as we try to act with conscience. I see a compelling continuity between the paper she presented today in her book, The Laws of White Dog, and also her long essay, The Story of Cruel and Unusual, which I highly recommend. In each of these studies, we see not only the triaging of different forms of life, but also the impossibility of drawing bright lines or very firm moral compasses. For as Colin points out, the very fact that language has to be accessed to represent these distinctions means that we fall into a Nietzschean notion of language. The famous passage I want to quote here is, he describes it as a mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, but after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. I underscore this idea of obligation. Language imposes itself as naturally arrived at and absolute, and it's our obligation to use these words as we assume they should be used. He goes on, truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are. Metaphors which are worn out and without sensuous power, coins which have lost their pictures, and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. And by coins, I want to emphasize this idea of exchange, of relationships between people, interactions. Language has become dead, simply a fact or a soundbite. So our use of language, I think, should always point to what has been omitted or covered up in the rush to mean something. Or in the cases we've heard today, the rush to judgment, the rush to act. The bitterly ironic contortions that occur in the pit bull cases seem merely to rehearse our fundamental problem with partitioning humanity, humaneness, viciousness, innocuousness, animality. Each of these terms not only leans on the other for meaning, but as it does, becomes infected by this proximity to others. What we hope to be a point of leverage is actually a shackling mechanism, and accountability flows back upon those who wish to remain above the fray as judges. After all, as I understand it, conscience also means to be mutually aware. Its modern meaning has occluded this mutuality, perhaps because the other with which or with whom we share an awareness has been pushed into the shadows, be it a deity, another human, or a pit bull, or perhaps a perfect storm. So it's not just human relations now that we must excavate from the reductive and naturalized world of language and communication, but a wider set of relations we have to the world itself. Now, I'm certainly not advocating postponing any action until we reach a pure and unambiguously right decision. We don't have the time, even if we are not pressed as urgently as the medical personnel were during Katrina. Life goes on. But what both Sheri Fink and Colin Dayan have demonstrated in their work is that consciences are assuaged, if only temporarily, always within life worlds that exceed the aspirations of rational choice-making. And perhaps we should not necessarily condemn ourselves for that, but modestly recognize our immense difficulty. Thank you.
We have time for question and discussion.
What is the protocol now? Do we respond?
Yes, so that's actually up to both of you. You can respond first to David's very rich comments, or we can, I think that would be, you can decide together on that, or we can go straight to questions from the audience.
Why don't you decide?
Do either of you have anything to say that you'd like to respond directly to David?
Well, yes, I could begin by just saying that what's so fascinating to me in David's work, just to talk a bit about your understanding of reason, is that in your work you really do open up the page to those other entities and to other possible languages. I'm thinking about his treatment of Coetzee's disgrace, which probably many of you know. But I was most fascinated by the Nietzsche that you spoke about, and I'm just wondering, language is a sum of human relations. Where was that?
I'm trying to...
On truth and falsity in the ultra-moral sense.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yes,
But that's very, very rich. So I just want to thank you for your comments.
Also, if Sheri and Colin want to respond to one another's
each other.
papers, we have time for that.
I also wanted to let people know that in order that Sheri hear everyone.
I actually didn't hear what was just said.
Yeah.
Or,
I was going to say, if in order that Sheri hear everyone, could we make sure that when we ask questions or say anything, we speak into a microphone? If you're in the audience, when that time comes, we have a roaming microphone, and so this, if I can maybe get a set of extra hands, this can go to the audience. Just turn it on. But we want to make sure that Sheri can actually hear what we're saying, and it has to go through the microphone system.
Can you hear me, Sheri?
Yes,
Okay.
I can hear.
Thank you for
and
your
I heard
work,
all of
and
what
it's-
went on, and appreciated very much all of your comments, both of you. And I don't have too much to add, other than to just say that I agree very much with two things that you said in the response. One, in terms of the centrality of the question of language, when these healthcare providers were speaking with me about this choice that they made to give these drugs, and I, as one example, a nurse standing next to a doctor, working on the same patients, giving the same medicines. One of them described it to me in the language of intentionality, being that the intention was to hasten the deaths of these patients. This was the physician who felt that they were in a panicked, scary situation, and that, hastening these deaths of these people he felt would die anyways, protecting them theoretically from the mobs raging outside of the hospital's walls was the ethical choice. And so he used language that clearly got to this sense of, yes, this was my intention. Whereas the nurse beside him used the language you referred to about providing comfort, and the goal providing, a respite from pain. And if it caused death, and death was foreseeable, certainly, but that wasn't the centrality of her intentions. And of course, that gets to the legal and ethical dimensions of that particular choice, because legally and ethically speaking, we do accept that certain medications can be given for the important goal of relieving suffering, even if that does risk death. And in that case, you would be considered within the ethical bounds of medicine and within the legal bounds of medicine. So it really does hang on that question of intentionality. And also, just to add one dimension to that, this question of the goals of that treatment. I think that one person described to me this question of whose pain is being relieved here, whose suffering is being relieved, and that the caregivers in this situation themselves were under a great deal enduring a great deal of suffering, just looking at the suffering of others. And maybe we can relate that to the way that we treat other animals as well, and the way that we may take on some of that, the sense that they have into our feelings. And certainly the medical caregivers are faced with that all the time. And then finally, this issue that you raised again, this desire to just get closure, to say that everything that was done in the heat of a terrible disaster, therefore it should be forgiven. And we saw that both with this case with a doctor who was arrested for hastening some of these deaths, and a grand jury decided not to indict her. She had huge support from the New Orleans public. Similarly, there were police who were accused and later actually indicted and found guilty of having needlessly killed civilians during this situation. And again, the public rose up and said, we should forgive them. They were acting in the heat of battle. And one moral philosopher who I spoke with very eloquently, I think, described this question as a question of, at the most difficult times, is our goal, should we forgive moral failings, or is this a time where we should expect to cling even more to those fundamental ethical and moral values? And I think I didn't say it quite as eloquently as him, but I think you get the idea. Does a disaster sort of allow us to forgive certain actions, or is it a time when we really need to turn the most strongly to those fundamental principles, because we are tempted by reason of empathy, by reason of lack of sleep or whatever, to engage in actions that in normal times would not be considered ethical. So I look forward to the questions.
Yes, Kent Grunewald?
Well,
Thank you.
so I wanted to pick up on this particular example and see what the responses are. it seems to me, I mean, they could be using different language, but that we could break down the problem so that it's not really dependent on the language. So we've got a technique that's going to reduce pain and increase the time of death. And there are at least two inquiries that one would make. One is, well, what is the genuine objective of the people that are giving the medicine? And then that's really a question of honesty or candor as opposed to something else. If their objective is one thing, but they say that the objective is the other thing. And of course, I think from the law's point of view, what the objective actually is crucial for the liability of the person who's giving the medicine. And then the other question is, well, what's the balance of how much reduction of pain is there going to be? How much is the time of death going to be increased? I mean, quickened. And what would the quality of life be like of the extra time that they would have if you didn't give the medicine? So if you relieve pain for 2 minutes and that increases death by 1 year, you'd say, no, that can't be that can't be an objective of relieving pain. That really has to be, about increasing the time of death. If you make a huge relief of pain and increases the time of death by a few minutes, then that's a totally different kind of situation. So that's the balance. Then we've got the question, well, the person who's making the decision, how should they be thinking about these things? And of course, I think mainly they should be thinking in terms of the balance. And probably, and I think this goes to the emergency situation and so on, they probably should try to think hard that they're not actually subconsciously or semi-consciously choosing the other objective because it's going to relieve them of the decision maker of some pain and make things easier for them. So they should try to put that aside and decide what's really good for the patient. Then the next thing is, though, how about an outsider, which could be in a legal case or it could be somebody else just making a moral judgment, who's judging what the decision maker has actually done in the case if they've given the medicine. And I think in that situation, if it is an emergency kind of thing and people are under great stress, it's reasonable to think that, it would be great if they could really be as moral and as deliberate and rational in that situation as in a less emergency situation. But that's not what human nature is like. People are, find themselves incapable of being as rational and so on in these situations. And so you'd give some kind of sense of excuse or reduction of with the wrongness if you think what they did was wrong. So I think there is a difference between what the decision maker himself should think about the emergency situation and try to do, and what the outsider doing the evaluation should think of what that person has done. Anyway, that's my take on that, and I'm interested in what all three of them have to say about that.
Those are really excellent points to bring to this discussion, and so I'll just go through a few of them that I might offer some thoughts on. One being the balance, that issue that you brought up about the timing of the death versus the relief of the pain and how you balance those two. And I think that's a really interesting question, and it gets to the slippery slope philosophy that many of you probably know about, the argument that if you start going down the path of euthanasia in a case where it seems very, well, how could this be a bad thing? We may have hastened her death by a few minutes, but in the balance, she had a relief of pain. Therefore, it was a good thing. And then, so, well, I'll just say, where do we draw that line? And the first case that I speak about in the article takes place where a doctor has climbed to the 8th floor. There's a woman who's clearly dying of very advanced cancer, has already been on morphine. He can't see how possibly she would survive being carried down the flights of stairs and waiting on a helipad in the heat. He wants the nurses who are up there caring for her to be able to deploy elsewhere. Everyone else in the unit is gone. And so he says, will you give her enough till she goes? And they up the morphine and she dies within hours. And you can kind of see who did that hurt, really. Then you get to the next day where 24 patients are being given these injections, including this gentleman, Emmett Everett, a man in his 50s, who's unfortunate man, paralyzed, spinal cord stroke. So he can't move. He's very heavy set, and but he's cracking jokes and he's very much alive, and he's given these drugs. So how do you, if you set a line, where do you set it, and how do you prevent it from going to places where we really feel very uncomfortable about it? And then in terms of the person making the decision, your points are really well taken. One thing beyond that is even who gets to be the decision maker here. And I haven't talked about the whole question of agency with that decision. Several of these patients had family members with them until they were told that they had to leave their patient's bedside shortly before these actions occurred. Could they have been brought into these decisions? What about the patients themselves? What about this gentleman, Emmett Everett? We don't know. Did the doctor go in and actually have a discussion with him? And, sometimes I think we don't think enough about allowing, particularly with that first triage decision about who goes first. There may very well have been patients or families who would have said, I'm very sick, take somebody else before me, or rather, I'm desperate to survive. My granddaughter's getting married next month. I know I'm elderly and I'm sick, but I want, my survival to be prioritized here. So I think that question of who gets to make these decisions is a very valid one, and we need to have larger community discussions about some of these issues of triage in disasters. And it's worth talking about the impact of these decisions, whereas a patient may have had only another day or a week or month to live. The family members, every single one who I interviewed for this story, were upset across the board. Even the lady who was very sick and about to die, the fact that a doctor had hastened her death, the family members felt just disrespected their mother, the disrespected her role as a valuable human being on this planet and all that she had done to serve others in her lives. The family members couldn't get their heads around that this was done and couldn't come to a peace about it. Whereas many of the caregivers involved said, well, if I had been that lady's family, I would have wanted this merciful thing to be done. But that's not how the families ended up feeling about it. And then finally, your point is just very well taken about the inability to be rational when you are with a lack of sleep for 4 days, when you're saddled with incredible responsibilities, when you don't know when you'll get out and you start to wonder about your own survival. So I think that it is very understandable why there was great sympathy for these people and why a jury decided not to indict this doctor.
Okay, so we'll have Ayel Press and then Fadi Judah.
Thank you both for really stimulating, interesting talks. I have two questions, Sheri, for you. First of all, let me say I have great respect for your work, and being a fellow reporter, perhaps that's why I want to push you a little more on what you mentioned in the beginning about reporters and conscience, with two questions, one of which is specific to journalists and reporters. The other also applies, I suppose, to academics and scholars. So the first question is, how much, I thought you were going to go into the tension and the challenge all reporters feel between saying and writing what they think, and writing about things they care about, and the commercial pressures that they face. So whether that means catering to the prejudices of your audience, or sensationalizing, and that's where I thought you were going, and so I'd love to hear your thoughts about how serious attention you think that is. The second one is a little trickier, and it's whether you think reporters, writers, scholars, for that matter, have an obligation to think about the moral impact, the political and moral impact that their work will have versus the obligation they have to tell it like they think it is. I ask in part because I just wrote a book about acts of conscience, and one of the questions I wrestled with at the end of the book, the book is sort of set against what I think are very honey-coded accounts of the righteous and others that are kind of these inspirational tales. The tales I tell are inspirational in some sense, but they're very dark in that the characters suffer egregiously. And so the question I wrestled with at the end was, if you tell these stories honestly, do you discourage people from acting in the way that these admirable people did? Because after all, there's an enormous price to pay. And if you look seriously at that price and you grapple with it honestly, you may end up having your readers say, well, that's all well and good. I'd never do that. And this book has shown me why. So those two questions.
Thanks. Well, I reflect the admiration right back at you. And that your book is a very important book, and I was pleased to be a fellow New America Fellow with you. Wonderful program, New America Foundation in DC, that supports writers who write books about
and relieves them from commercial pressures temporarily.
So getting to that first point about the tension between, commercial, pleasing your audience, pleasing your editors, picking topics or stories that are potentially commercial, or spinning things in a way that they will, meet a receptive audience, sensationalizing. And I think many reporters do grapple with it. Many, perhaps I didn't mention it because I've been fortunate enough to be able a lot of times to choose what I write about, but in this current climate of drastically shrunken budgets for major news organizations, it is very hard. Many tens of thousands of reporters have lost their jobs in recent years, and I think a lot of reporters who I've met are doing the kinds of work that they don't feel as passionate about, that they have this urge to write about topics that they feel are important and in a real way, and precisely because of that commercial pressure, just the ability to survive, they're not able to do that work. So it is tough, and there's very often a tension between even telling it like it is, telling the truth, and spinning a story into something that's more gripping or interesting. And that's, I think, clearly the reporter's role to make it less interesting if it really is less interesting or less sensational or less definitive. When the truth is different, but it doesn't come without great difficulty sometimes. And then in terms of your other point, do reporters and scholars have an obligation to think about the political or moral impact of what you write versus just telling it like it is? And I think that very much gets at one of the things that I was trying to talk about, which is, should we be caring about what the impact is? And I spoke about that with specific reference to the impact on individuals we write about. But then again, sometimes you can imagine that if I write this story, it will change a law, or it will sway the public this way or that. And I think that's a really tough question as to whether that should come into our calculus. And I think it very often does, because a lot of times people get into journalism because they have a bit of an activist streak, and whereas they try to be objective, they are choosing stories for the reasons of having an impact in some way. I mean, ProPublica, which is the news organization where I worked, their motto is journalism in the public interest, and they will only publish things that are related to illuminating abuses of power and violations of the public trust. So there's that's the frame right from the very beginning. So I guess I would leave it at that.
Can I just press you a bit? I'm fascinated by the questions that Eyal asked, and I wanted to know, when you say activist in the traditional sense, could you elaborate? I was interested in your opposition between telling a story in an objective manner or in the tradition of activism. I just wonder if you could spell out a bit. That's such a... I'm not sure what you mean by objective as opposed to act. I mean, can you just elaborate a little bit? What would an activist manner be? Something that you mean took a political side, or?
I don't think she heard you.
I'm sorry. I was just pressing you
Did you hear
because
that
it's a
question?
subject that interests me a great deal. How one writes and why. But is it I think there are so many different concerns that you've brought up that are really intriguing and also mysterious. For example, do you write to get to the larger, so that many people of all different types can read it? That's what I understand you're saying about writing in an objective manner so that you can have a larger audience, whereas the writing in an activist manner would mean that you would limit your audience. I'm just wanting to hear more about it because I definitely struggle with the danger of a polemic that at certain times seems to be necessary, but definitely limits my readers or, as you were saying, prohibits publication. So I would like to hear you talk about how you balance it because your work is so tremendous. So. Yeah, so
okay,
if you could just...
thanks. Yeah, at first I was thinking your question was directed back at Eyal. Well, I think I was saying not so much that it limits your audience, because you can be an opinion writer and have a great audience and following, and certainly have many people who fall into that category. And polemical works have had great impact in the past. So I think I was speaking from the perspective of someone writing straight news for mainstream, what we consider the mainstream media, where you are limited in that way from really expressing opinions, and where you're expected to try to be objective. And we can obviously have a discussion till the cows go home about what that means and whether that's really possible. But I think for the sake of our discussion, we can make that differentiation between straight news and opinion. And so I actually think that there is a role for both of those, and that you can have a large audience in both of those cases. What my point was more just the level of trust of your audience, that the idea is, if you're a news reporter, that you will maintain trust with your audience if you're seen to be more objective. And so that is one reason to limit your, what would be traditional activist activities, and to limit the way that you may be activist in your writing. But we can even argue about that. Perhaps you're trusted more if you're showing your cards, and there are certainly people who feel that way, and that may be a very valid argument.
Thank you.
David, did you want to respond to this specific issue? Or okay, so we have Fadi Judah's question.
No, I just wanted to comment back on the physician choices by perhaps Kent just maybe bringing up a parallel, which is in humanitarian medicine, which is to say that almost always, there are some cases, a physician of fundamentally a Western NGO, Doctors Without Borders or otherwise, is never asked to address his or her decisions, moral decisions in the field. And I find that to be, while we can say there are issues with international law regarding, to explain why this doesn't happen, and issues of infrastructure and logistics, as a Western-trained physician and a practicing physician, I would say that it has also something to do with the molecular details of how we're trained in the U.S. to make those decisions. I would maybe I'd like to sort of be provocative and take it to an extreme, but on the whole, we are trained as young people who are in their 20s, suddenly thrown into sleepless nights of internship and what have you, to not necessarily resist the notion that the patient is a form of a burden to you, because they are a form of a burden to you. Your sleep, your comfort, the difficulties of conscious and decision making, and when you're trained in county hospitals in particular, and you have the poor and the drug addicts and the illegal immigrants or and what have you, and those on dialysis and those not on dialysis, and you begin in that process of decision making pretty early on, always with the safety net that the system has such a thorough infrastructure as a safety net that your decisions and their inadequate conscience or moral thoroughness are okay, because the system won't let you screw it up. You're not the sole provider of the decision making, even when you think you are. There's a hospital system, a nurse, a consultant, a family, a legal ghost hanging over you, and what have you. And it's very interesting for me that the stories in the hospital in New Orleans simply, I don't want to be too reductive, but to a large effect occurred that way also because there was absolutely no safety net left. And I basically want to throw this back at the way we are trained to practice capitalist medicine, and suddenly there's a crisis, and this sort of economy of life and death kicks in. I am not, having been also a physician, Doctors Without Borders, I'm not discounting the confusion and sort of the moral horrors one as a physician would live with various decisions one makes about other people's lives and deaths and suffering. But I honestly think this is. I can't. At least I speak like this because I realize that some of my most and still today, for instance, when I speak about hospice to patients in a clinic, not in a hospital, I realize how much my thinking and my language is influenced by a training system and the language of that training system and the infrastructure behind that language in the training system.
Well, you put this in a way, it's interesting because one might think, well, look, under any systems, they might differ in what they train people to do, but that's going to be sort of similar. But you've put this in a way as if there's a preferable way of doing it, and I think it would be interesting for you to tell us what the preferable way would be.
Yeah, I have my ideas, but I maybe it's sort of like a Socratic way of answering instead of just saying, well, this is, because instead of proposing a solution and a whole method, not that I have one per se, but I do think that one easy way to sort of address your question or your proposal is to say that how much of the medical practice or the medical profession or the medical service, how much of it has to be really tied in training to sort of economics and mathematics of knowledge. How much of it has to be that way? I think it's a fundamental problem because that's what you're faced with. For instance, I'll just give you an example related to numbers. You're a hero if you know how to, when you're a resident, if you know how to play turf wars, which means that you refuse patient admissions. Okay? And the reason is because you're reducing your numbers. And you're a hero if you reduce your length of stay for patients who come into the hospital. And eventually, without knowing it as someone in a county hospital, as an intern or a resident, without knowing it, this is filtering down from the private practice, because in private practice, hospitalists and insurance companies or whatever make money depending on length of stay issues. It has little to do with patient needs and care. So how much of that really can we address economically and legally?
Can I respond a bit to what you've said? I actually agree with the gist of what you're saying. I do think that economics and that just sort of inculcation of the training and of the system played a big role here. I suspect that it did in the case that we're talking about with the New Orleans doctors. Part of that is just an utter reliance on high technology and the assumption that if we don't have every tool, every expensive and electricity dependent tool at our disposal, then we're essentially powerless as physicians. And that is what people felt in this situation. But for those of you who worked in Doctors Without Borders, or people who work in developing countries where power is very often not available, clean water, et cetera, high technology implements to treat patients, there is still something that you can get done for people. There is sometimes in those situations very much a sense of inability to accomplish things, and a fatalism and a withdrawal from emotional connection with patients. But I've also seen the opposite. I've seen great improvisation. I did a story about a woman in India who came up with a very makeshift, cheap way of creating a positive pressure source of oxygen for little babies during the H1N1 pandemic, when they were hit hard and didn't have enough high-tech ventilators. So they were able to possibly save some babies' lives using a very inexpensive kind of makeshift technique. So I think a lot of times, because we're inculcated, because we just are always flooded with advertisements for the latest drug and the latest high technology surgical implements and techniques, that we forget that we have some innate healing powers, if you want to put it that way, that may not be dependent on that sort of economic structure that's there. And then, so that's one element of it. And then the other element, this sort of utilitarian calculation of what a life is worth, is very much present in the thinking of people who are making these decisions. And there's a lot of thinking actually now going on amongst medical communities about what should we do if we're hit with a horrible pandemic, say, and we don't have enough ventilators to go around. Which lives should we save? Which individuals should be admitted to the hospitals and to the ICUs? Who should be prioritized to get a ventilator? And you hear a lot of thinking that is very much along the lines of money, and I wouldn't say, which patients will make the most money, but just in terms of cost benefits, and this very stark utilitarian analysis that leaves out questions of justice and equality and historical economic disparities that lead to current health problems that may make one patient sicker than another, kind of relating back to those things. Not sure if I'm being terribly clear about that, but I think it's very prevalent, and I think we need to think very hard about how those issues influence decisions, and whether we as a society want to make decisions based on those kinds of that kind of calculus. So thank you for contributing that.
Nancy?
I have a question for Sheri also, but I think that actually for both speakers, for Colin and for Sheri, and I think I'm going to start with Colin. And I'm very well. First of all, I'd like to say that both papers, presentations, all three of them actually were extremely interesting, and I'm interested in the difference between, in terms of conscience, between crisis situations that are anomalous and everyday situations. The way in which we relate to animals is something that happens to most people every day. So you had said that what we need to understand, we have to find a third term between dehumanizing animals entirely and anthropomorphizing animals, so between being mean to animals and loving animals. And I think the anthropocentric approach is a kind of dehumanization of the animal as well, because it turns the animal into us. So we need to kind of go beyond those two ways of relating to the animal. We need to find the animalness of the animal.
Well, I think also to use human and non-human animal is more, I guess, accurate, given that I keep pressing for animality found in the least likely of places. And as we were speaking about decisions made about the decent death or putting one out of pain, I couldn't help but think about those corners that we don't often think about. For example, which dogs get euthanized and why? It's very interesting, the salvation, for example, of the Michael Vick dogs, given that they were crippled and maimed. When you put that next to the large numbers of dogs that are put down from alleged dogfighting operations who are totally healthy, this happens nearly every week in the South, to the tune of 200, pit bulls at a time. I think part of the question about putting one out of misery or making the decision to maintain the dignity of a human can gain a great deal in looking at the non-human. Again, I guess I'm thinking more in the form of a question. If we look at a case like Bays versus Reese, Justice Roberts decided in this lethal injection case that the 3-drug protocol was not cruel and unusual punishment. The question about the 3-drug protocol was that even veterinarians wrote briefs saying that they wouldn't kill their dog. They don't kill dogs in that manner. They use one drug. That, oddly enough, the choice of killing for a prison and killing a human is far more painful. Justice Roberts made his decision in terms that I think are legally very, very compelling, that the 3-drug protocol, one of the drugs paralyzes the condemned so that as they're lying there, they cannot express pain if they have not had enough of a drug to dull the pain. The problem is the paralytic drug, and the argument was, why not do away with this paralytic drug, which totally encases the human in his suffering, and he cannot cry out, he cannot demonstrate that he's still alive. Justice Roberts argued that the reason for the paralytic drug was to maintain the dignity of both the viewers and the condemned. And that's when I begin to think about terminology. Maybe it's because I'm trained as an English professor, but the idea of what that term dignity and the decent death implies, that's the question. So I think to answer your very, very good question about why turn to what we call animal and question the terrain of animality is because I want fundamentally to make a problem of the assumptions that we make when we make life and death choices for certain kinds of dogs or certain kinds of people in terms of those very humane words that mean you care, decency or dignity. I don't know if that explains it, but I think a lot of my work is propelled by moving into the corners of the reprehensible or the excluded to see how language works there and then understand what words can hide in our daily lives. And that's why I think that the question of deciding who should die and when and why often reflects back in such interesting ways on the ideals of the person who is making the decision. And so, I don't know.
Well, can I just elaborate on the question, which I think will help understand your question a little bit, because ultimately we're constrained to this language, as you say, and it's always ambivalent, this language, and of course it changes from case to case. And you're well. Let me just give you a couple of cases, which I think to a degree trace the way we've human beings have come to relate to animals. So the first one would be Nietzsche's assessment about cows. Since we've been talking about cows, cows show up in Anne's film. And at the beginning of the use and abuse of history, he invokes the cows. He passes a field of cows and he says that they live unconsciously in the present, which would mean that they don't feel pain, they don't feel the pain of memory, they don't feel the pain of anxiety. There's no residue left in their lives. They are simply presentness, embodied presentness. Then we go to Anne's cows in the film, My Neighbor, My Killer. And you and I had very different takes on what those cows meant. It was very interesting to me. So for me, on the one hand, part of the crime of genocide, you killed all my children and you took 2 of my cows or 2 of my goats. It's shocking to think of those 2 things in the same, as having, even in the same sentence, when somebody who's testifying says, here's your crime. But I understood the cows also to mean that there's some kind of continuity in the lives of these people, despite what happened to them, that their lives were essentially, their everyday lives were essentially the same, and the cows were a symbol of that sameness. And then the third example, not surprisingly, is Coetzee's books, Elizabeth Costello in Disgrace in particular, which I think must be extremely important to you, as well as the book around what happens in Disgrace. Elizabeth Costello, I'm sorry, where she very controversially makes an analogy between the mass slaughter of animals for human consumption and the Holocaust, and of course is ostracized by the people who invited her to lecture. And then there's the, in a way more interesting for me, situation of David Lurie in Disgrace, who is demoted from professor of English to professor of communications, but then, after being fired from his job, finds himself a euthanizer of dogs. So my question basically comes down to this. In your presentation, so we're talking about various symbolic ways in film, in philosophy, in literature, of trying to understand the animal. And we're constrained, as you said, to language. So you make the metaphor of the bridge, for example. And of course, it's a unilateral type of thing, because dogs or animals, unless you're in a Disney film, don't talk back. They don't talk. So you're making faces which...
Oh, I think that we're on such fascinatingly distinct planes. I can't wait to try to answer and to speak with you, because our approach is wonderfully, wonderfully distinct, and I want to be able to try to address your way of speaking about this.
Well, that would be interesting too, because we're on the same, I think we're on the same page in terms of animal rights, but that we've got 2 kind of very different takes.
I think it's, okay, let me say it first. Thank you for bringing up Consider the Cattle, the Nietzsche, because it stays with me. It's one of the most excruciatingly complicated passages in all of Nietzsche, when he sets us, his readers, in front of these cows who don't think, and humans envy them, their happiness. But I always found that as that essay on the use and abuse of history went on, it became very complicated. Exactly what Nietzsche intended his reader to think about those cows. And as a small aside, I think that Nietzsche's idea about what is the not human is set in the form of a question, because he's talking about the making of history and what it means to have too much, to know and recall too much. So he begins with that opposition of the blank lack of memory on the part of all these cows in the field, and the idea of one who remembers too much. But I think that as he writes, the problem of perspective becomes very vexed or questionable. So when I said that I think we might be approaching things a little bit differently, I think that the question that has been compelling me over the last 2 years is, what are you doing? Why are you, who have been working to write about what's happening in Haiti, working with prisoners and talking about supermax confinement, what are you doing now focusing on the animal? Because I am not speaking from a position of an animal rights activist. Instead, given the kind of world we're living in, I am trying to think through what we mean by the creaturely, what we share with animals, because we are animals, and the human and the non-human set up a rather interesting dichotomy, which has throughout history been very serviceable for those who want to oppress. That's the most simplistic answer. But I think that the more difficult one is that, unlike you, I believe that, I sense that animals, specifically dogs, have an awareness, a knowing. It's simply not describable in the terms that we understand. Let me put it this way. I am a person who believes that the crisis about faith, I mentioned Niebuhr for a reason. I think that he had a lot of very important things to say about the problem with the idea of progress, with the idea of, shall we say, the secular liberal humanism. And one of the problems is the assurance that that gives one that they are being good or just. Unlike the indeterminacies of faith, and I believe that there are other kinds of knowing that lead us into worlds that are far more difficult than the ones perhaps that we typically see. For example, animal sacrifice in Haiti. So that I'm really trying to open up, I think, a conversation with the uncomfortable so that our language changes and becomes less of a possible overlay to assumptions that should be questioned. I don't know if that answers your point, but I'm not taking animals in the work as a kind of symbol of any kind, but especially in the legal cases I treat, very, very often the decisions that have been applied in terms of animal treatment are the test runs for cases about human treatment. And I do think that there's a great deal to be gained then by kind of upending a lot of our conversations that begin with the human, let me say human animal. I don't know if that even goes near you, but I think I might be approaching this from a more ground level, kind of non-symbolic, more metonymic, non-metaphoric way.
No, that reminds me of Steve Knapp's critique of Jay Bernstein's critique of Hannah Arendt's thinking about thinking, because he says you can't think without language. And language has a history. Therefore, you can't think without conversing with someone who possibly is incapable of accessing what you're talking about, of accessing an entirely new way of understanding something.
I think it might put us in touch with large majorities of people in the world who still believe strongly in deities or a deity, and who still have very close relations, let us say, with animals that are distinct from our own.
Yeah, yeah.
So we have time actually just to return to David's question or comment that he has. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up at 11. But I wanted to say one thing that I think is interesting about the relationship between these two presentations is I was thinking about Colin's emphasis on corners, that the sort of forgotten areas that our conscience sort of does or doesn't reach, or that we aren't aware of. And I was thinking about this. I think in both of your work, there's a certain level of emphasis on trying to redirect or fine-tune the sort of lens of an ethical attention toward, people abandoned in the upper floors of buildings who are totally invisible to news cameras in general, or to the general public's awareness, or to spheres of, ontological experience that we actually can't access, even if we wanted to. And I think that's an interesting way, interesting contribution to this, that this question of, to whom or for whom do we feel conscience? And then there's the question that both of you are raising, for whom ought we to feel conscience? And can we even, if conscience is a sort of uncontrolled impulse that we have or don't have at certain times and not others in complicated situations, can we begin to talk about, training conscience, or asking this question of for whom should we feel? For whom should we feel? But I wanted to turn to David.
Okay, just very shortly, wanted to touch on something that Colin mentioned, and loop in both Sheri and also Eyal here. You mentioned the relationship between conscience and citizenship. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, but then also in terms of this pit bull thing and reporting. I mean, there was a very famous case in San Francisco about maybe 15, 20 years ago, and I wanted to get, the way the press covered it had much less to do with pit bulls and more to do with the income bracket, the heterosexuality of the couple, their age, and in a sense, the idea was, they were being tried in the press. I mean, this is a phrase that came over and over and over again. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the press, its role in accessing this idea of citizenship, but then overlaying it with all this extraneous data that then complicates this notion of what a citizen's obligation is, and becomes much more of a, it was less than this, the idea of a citizenship, but neighborhoods, right? Because you didn't really care about people that were living way away, but your neighborhood all of a sudden became the marker of identification.
Thank you. I think you're talking about the San Francisco case. They weren't pit bulls. They were Presa Canarios, a very different kind of mastiff. But I think we immediately think mauling equals pit bull. But to get to your point about the media and citizenship, it's striking, the one-on-one lamination of the African-American male onto the pit bull. It's not you we're afraid of, it's your dog. And I think that your question about citizenship is so crucial, because the media, in focusing on, to take your lovely words about the corners, I think the media focuses on and sheds light on what we think of as the corners, the transgressive. And the problem here is that there's a seamlessness between those scenes that the media harbors and keeps embellishing and the daily lives of those we think of as our neighbors and citizens. And I think that the media coverage of pit bull attacks, which many people write about, the problem in identifying the breed, but I think most of all, the question of the precarious nature of what it means to be included and how easy it is to become excluded and exterminated is a question, finally, David, about the citizen who is of value and the citizen who is en train de losing their citizenship, their rights and duties, because they are somehow already affiliated with a zone of being that has been, through the media, declared as disposable. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the San Francisco case was especially interesting because there you did have the whole class divide and color as well.